Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Thank you for joining me on this live stream entitled Emmanuel Levinas on Law, Freedom, and the Temptation of Temptation. So, taking commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with Us, a book that I just had to write on the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, as I've been so uh, influenced by it, so impressed by it, and continue to go back again and again to the work of Emmanuel Levinas. So it's a joy to begin a live stream series or kind of continuous series on the work of Levinas, but especially this topic of law and freedom. How do we understand human freedom in relation to God, in relation to law, as Thomas Aquinas might talk about, in relation to eternal law, divine law, human law, all these various kinds of law, natural law. How do we understand freedom in relation to law? When we hear the word law, is it immediately something that would seem to be an obstacle to freedom? Or is there the possibility of the paradox that law might open us to a greater freedom than the self is able to intuit by itself? So Levinas brings us to face many paradoxes in thinking about law, freedom, and what he calls the temptation of temptation. We want to think with him in this 1964 Talmudic lecture, what does he mean by the temptation of temptation? And how might this arena of the temptation of temptation inhibit the full flourishing and freedom? So let's think with Levinas. There is a perennial ambiguity within the relationship between law and human freedom. Does law inherently promote freedom or restrict it? Emmanuel Levinas proposes that law, precisely the Jewish Torah, is the gateway of freedom to the degree that law attests to the obligatory summons to responsibility for the other. This is the phrase in the work of Levinas. I never tire of saying it: responsibility for the other, or responsibility for the other who faces me. Responsibility is the term for the work of Emmanuel Levinas. In his 1964 Talmudic lecture, entitled The Temptation of Temptation, Levinas presents the paradoxical beginning of freedom in a non-freedom which, far from being slavery or childhood, is a beyond freedom, overcoming the temptation of evil by avoiding the temptation of temptation. So right away we think along with Levinas and wonder, what does he mean by freedom found in a non-freedom, which, far from being slavery or childhood, is a beyond freedom, overcoming the temptation of evil by avoiding the temptation of temptation. So we can think with Levinas here about some various rings of moral activity for a human person. And so we'll just draw a person and then think about these various zones. And I probably should not draw them in this relationship, but another one. I'll begin with the human person here. The human person who is after freedom. Freedom from anything that would oppress the person, confine the person, restrict the person, to be free. Every person wants to be free, not only free to choose, but free to access the fullness of goodness. So freedom itself is not an absolute, but it implies the good. And we have the fall from freedom beginning with what Levinas calls the temptation of temptation, not even temptation itself, but the temptation of temptation. And we would have another ring then, temptation itself, what we mean by that. And then we have another ring, what we might call sin. And here is, we could say, slavery, bondage of a person. And one can fall through these zones, moving from freedom to slavery. But it begins with this temptation of temptation. Not even temptation itself, temptation to sin, but the temptation of temptation. This is so interesting. What might he mean by this? And altogether, he's also using the language of evil as we move away from freedom, a deprivation of freedom, a deprivation of goodness. Is this movement down as I'm drawing it? A movement from good to evil. Even the first principle, practical reason for metaphysics is do good, avoid evil. But Levinas is talking about this slow fade, this gradual decline of a person away from freedom. And it begins with this temptation of temptation. So this is the progression, a gradual progression. But what's so interesting about Levinas' philosophical argument here is that I think so many of us are very comfortable to live in this zone of the temptation of temptation, where we might say, well, I'm not sinning and I'm not in total bondage to evil, but I'm playing around, flirting with temptation. I'm not quite even there in temptation itself and moving towards sin, but I like to understand my freedom as including this zone of the temptation of temptation. And in fact, we might say, perhaps many of us include within our understanding of freedom the zones of all of these things. Temptation of temptation, temptation itself, sin, the freedom to sin, and the freedom to become a slave to something, even by denying it. So in any case, Levinas is really focusing on this zone right here and saying how the zone of the temptation of temptation compromises the integrity of freedom. And once we start this slippery slope into the temptation of temptation, temptation proper will follow, sin will follow, slavery will follow. It's the logic of, we could say, evil, of decline, of disintegration, versus the logic of the good, the logic of true freedom. So this is what we want to follow with Levinas, thinking about the meaning of the temptation of temptation. And again, it's a very paradoxical freedom that he's proposing. So in terms of our common understanding of freedom, that would involve at least the temptation of temptation, if not temptation itself, if not sin itself. He's saying we have to begin to understand freedom as a non-freedom. That is a beyond freedom, a beyond that kind of freedom, freedom understood as license, freedom understood as arbitration between alternatives within a choice, freedom understood as choice itself. But he's thinking of a freedom beyond choice, involving choice, but transcending simple choice. Because to choose what is evil is to become less free. So choice itself is not the essence of freedom. Freedom is something to be lived into by choosing the good consistently. Thank you for the comment on my new haircut. Yes, fresh as of this morning. Glad you like it. So, in other words, law demands a restraint of freedom if we understand freedom as an arbitrary license in order to open onto a collective and coexistent freedom of responsibility. Levinas' thesis bears significantly on crucial ethical dilemmas of today. For example, ecological degradation, severe poverty, and even eugenic movements that we observe on a global scale. In demonstrating the direct correlation between freedom and responsibility, Levinas applies the philosophical framework needed to undergird the practical remedies for our most dire social and ecological ills. So, how we understand freedom has a lot to do with how we live. Because I think we all would agree, I want to be free rather than not free. But how do I understand freedom? And what kind of value is it within my own hierarchy of values? And how does freedom motivate me to live in an ethical way? These are the questions Levinas is asking. But his turn to Torah is not enough, I argue overall, that Levinas' ethical phenomenology of proclamation must be paired with a contemplative phenomenology of manifestation, so not to engender action without considering what exactly gives itself to act upon. So I always like to pair Emmanuel Levinas with Jean-Luc Marion. That's what I do throughout this book. And where I would go eventually with this presentation. But for today, I just want to think about the argument of Levinas and save that rapprochement between Levinas and Marion for a later time. In order for us to approach Levinas' understanding of law and freedom with clarity, it is necessary to begin with his critique of what he calls the temptation of temptation, as introduced in his 1964 Talmudic lecture by the same name. In her 2002 book entitled Emmanuel Levinas, The Problem of Ethical Metaphysics, Edith Visegrod articulates well what Levinas means by the temptation of temptation and its relevance for people today. She writes, according to Levinas, the difficulty of Western man is rooted in his need to experience everything that can be experienced. Isn't that true for, we would say, Western man, postmodern man? That he wants to experience everything possible, everything that can be experienced. I've seen many credit card commercials on television lately, and it's like portraying, especially young adults, trying to experience all these things, these restaurants and traveling and entertainment, all these different events, and as if that's like the essence of life, tasting all the possibilities, she says, that life affords. This is the temptation of temptations. The paradigms of Western man are Ulysses, whose life is filled with novel and perilous adventure, and Don Juan, for whom a multiplicity of seductions provides a heightened sense of existence. It is of great moment to engage one's passions in life and to live dangerously. Innocence seems infantile and merely provisional, awaiting transformation by life itself. So Edith Visegrod is helping us understand Levinas' concept of this temptation of temptation in opposition to freedom. And we might read from the work of a Brazilian scholar of the epistemology of psychology, Emmanuel Meirelles Vieira. He writes that ideas of freedom and of the individual are essential to reason for it to legitimize itself as a suitable form of knowing the world, resulting in the self-centered individual postulated by modernity. Similarly, commenting on the work of Immanuel Kant, Richard Cohen writes that, quote, the moral agent is free and hence subject to moral judgment, unlike objects which are caused, only insofar, Kant argues, that the agent is rationally self-legislating. So both of these kinds of references underscore a deep influence of the Western Enlightenment on our present concept of freedom, which includes in its as a prelude the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries, and these influences on the modern day notions of human freedom and uninhibited self-determination. But Levinas inspired alternative to this autonomous self-determining freedom we can think about as heteronymous freedom, as opposed to autonomous freedom. So we continue to think then about how we understand freedom in these postmodern times of the 21st century. Sayings like, leave no stone unturned, or to quote the poet, gather ye rosebuds as ye may. This is the essence of the 21st century wisdom, especially within a materialist paradigm that interprets the whole of reality as matter in motion and nothing more. Vishagrod's summary of Levinas' original concept, called the temptation of temptation, is made with precision. The heightened sense of existence is the prize won for ceding all constraints of law, conscience, religion, authority other than the self, and any predetermined conception of the good whatsoever. According to the common understanding of freedom, life is lived to the fullest inasmuch as it is filled with new and unpredictable experiences, endless prospects of enjoyment, and sensational excursions ever on the brink of peril and misfortune. Ulysses and Don Juan are paragons of the good life because of their promiscuous pursuit of the varied flavors of life. Innocence and childlike naivete are to be awakened and vacated for the sake of becoming the seasoned adult who assumes the privilege of connoisseur in relation to the plethora of stimulating experiences life has to offer. And there's an acronym circulating among us today in culture, especially young people, young adults. YOLO, you only live once. Many young people, at least subconsciously, swear allegiance to this kind of life philosophy before any other tradition of faith or standard of rationality. In other words, Epicureanism and hedonism have resurfaced today, even if in effigy, supplanting traditional religions as an absolute source of personal values and moral decision making. However, instead of pleasure itself as the guiding goal of action, experience for its own sake reigns supreme, whether resulting in pleasure or pain for the actor, as if there's no difference. But just to experience something is the essence of this you only live once philosophy. It is more desirable for experience to be untethered to any guiding principle in order to preserve its purity and anarchical formless form. Rationality as such is dropped for the Dionysian predilection for experience absent justification, just for the heck of it, you could say. I'm just doing it. I don't know why I'm doing it. I'm just doing it to experience something. And again, Levinas would describe this phenomenologically through his work called On Escape, L'évasion, where the self wants to escape from itself. This is what we also understand by freedom, the evacuation of the self from itself in some kind of ecstatic movement outside of the self. And this is typically sought in pleasure, jouissance, you say in French, but in our time in post-modernity, uh, even pleasure lacks rationality. And so just any experience itself, whether involving pleasure, pain, contradiction, rational, irrational, it doesn't matter. Just doing something to begin that evacuation of the self outside of itself, but with no orientation as to a definite direction of living, of experience, even of desire. Desires themselves have become so jumbled. If there be any justification at all for experience today, actions are justified merely in the name of pillaging virgin experience. Many would rather regret what they have done rather than regret what they have not done. Enter the temptation of temptation. What's meant by this? The lead singer from the band Green Day, um, he talked. Billy Joe Armstrong, I think is his name. He said this once, that he would rather regret what he did rather than regret than what he did not do. And that's this temptation of temptation, to leave no stone unturned, to try to experience everything possible, even with a kind of phenomenological approach to things. One could take on this kind of worldview. And this is what Levinas is calling living in this zone of the temptation of temptation. And Levinas is arguing, however, all this being said, that this idea is opposed to authentic freedom, to genuine freedom. We want to think with him, why is this the case? Why not go out and try to experience everything? Why not throw all caution to the winds? Why not try to live with no regrets, precisely by in and through experiencing everything? But Levinas says this approach will lead definitely to slavery and destruction. It's so paradoxical because it sounds so good, it sounds so logical, it sounds so open to possibility. But instead, Levinas brings us back, still through the method of phenomenology, to something besides the empty promises of the temptation of temptation. For Levinas, the temptation of temptation refers precisely to the temptation of knowledge, in which, quote, what tempts the one tempted by temptation is not pleasure, but the ambiguity of a situation in which pleasure is still possible, but in respect to which the ego keeps its liberty, has not yet given up its security, has kept its distance. What is tempting is to be simultaneously outside everything and participating in everything. End quote. This is how Levinas talks about the temptation of temptation, to be simultaneously outside everything and yet participating in everything. So what we experience, especially with, we could say, the Google phenomenon, where something might begin with a curiosity to know, to observe, to perceive anything and everything, while keeping one's distance behind the screen, oftentimes anonymously behind the screen. I want to go experiencing everything in the world through the World Wide Web and remain anonymous, always at least maintain an ounce of innocence, because after all, I'm just behind a screen. After all, I didn't bring up the search results. I just entered a curious term. Uh, After all, having so many alibis to excuse oneself, to live with this kind of pretentious innocence within the zone of the temptation of temptation. The ego wants to keep its liberty, keep its distance, not totally give up its security, give out its identity, but still experience as much as possible incognito. Incognito. Why is it that we have in our search engines incognito tabs, or don't remember the history of the search? All of these phenomena point to what Levinas is calling the temptation of temptation. And so we think with him, what's wrong with this? In other words, the temptation of temptation occurs in the dark interstices of ambiguity between the object of temptation and the tempted, between marginal culpability and accusation, between anonymity and personal identity. The dark interstices between these things, that's where the temptation of temptation lives. Again, in other words, this ambiguity. There's an object of temptation and the one being tempted. They're not the same thing. But at what point does one cross the line into actual temptation, into actually desiring that object that is tempting the moral self? That difference between marginal culpability, I'm ambiguously guilty, but I'm even not sure, and accusation, or even the accusation of conscience. We see the space between these things. And finally, the difference between anonymity, living incognito, especially in these virtual spaces of being, and the one's personal identity with name and number and address and even IP address. So, in the experience of being tempted by temptation, the ego is disengaged just enough to render itself incognito before the light of conscience itself. So, not only being incognito in relation to other people, witnesses of the person lurking closer and closer to actual temptation and then actual sin, but even remaining a stranger to oneself. Isn't that an incredible phenomenon that can happen with the ego? That the ego doesn't even recognize himself or herself anymore. Not even looking in the mirror, not even through self reflection, but that we can have avatars of the ego happening in real life and virtual life. And that virtual life influences this proliferation of the avatars of the ego. So we can think about all these real things within lived experience today. In the experience of being tempted by temptation, there is an escorting of the ego to the threshold of sin. Escorting the ego to the threshold of sin. So temptation itself, we could say, is the threshold of sin, but not yet sin. But the threshold of the threshold is what Levinas is calling the temptation of temptation itself. So we have this experience of being tempted by temptation, all the while suspending an explicitly, objectively sinful act, though advancing as far as possible before the buffer of actual temptation. Living in the temptation of temptation is to enjoy the anonymous autonomy before all that is possible, all that is knowable, and all that is pleasurable. The temptation of temptation exalts free will as divine, like Schopenhauer, for example, since the very notion of free will indicates self-determination rather than being determined from without. The temptation of temptation brackets and sets aside all that would impinge upon the sovereignty of the will. This becomes the essence of freedom, unrestraint. Anything that would impinge upon the will is regarded as a hindrance to absolute freedom. So this is painting the picture of the temptation of temptation as Levinas understands it. And so we want to think more about this with a Dominican moral theologian named Survey Pincers in his 1985 book called The Sources of Christian Ethics. And in this book, Pinker contrasts the two primary ways of understanding human freedom today. First, what he calls a freedom of indifference, and second, we could say a freedom for excellence, which is very much influenced by the work of Thomas Aquinas. So I want to help understand Levinas' understanding of freedom through the work of Survey Pinker on these points. So stemming from the arguments of 14th century English Franciscan theologian William of Ockham and his critique of the moral teleology of Thomas Aquinas, freedom of indifference intuits the essence of freedom as the operation of free will in its autonomous and uninhibited choice between contraries. This is what is called nominalism. This nominalist approach views ultimate freedom as the will unrestrained by anything greater than itself, whether divine will, right reason, natural law, predetermined ends of action, or any particular impression of beatitude or idea of happiness. This type of freedom, this freedom of indifference, is linked to the genitive of indifference, to refer to its indifferent attitude toward what the will chooses. One is most free according to this concept the more one exercises an attitude of indifference in relation to competing objects parading before the will. In a freedom of indifference, each free act is independent of all the others, and law is external to freedom, which would otherwise limit it by some sense of obligation to obey the law. In this freedom of indifference, each individual act is measured neither in relation to past acts nor to future acts. Law neither proceeds from nor promotes this freedom of indifference, but curtails the naturally unalloyed power of free will. So law in this concept of freedom of indifference is understood as something that fences in human action in a unfavorable kind of way. Law is seen as a necessary evil, even for this freedom that understands free will as absolute, arbitration as absolute. In a freedom of indifference, everything is fair game for the will, just as in the temptation of temptation, all temptations are neutralized by the distance between the self and each instance of actual temptation. In both the freedom of indifference and in the temptation of temptation, free will is understood to be identical with what is meant by freedom. Free will is absolute. But this is not the concept of Levinas. So it's really important that as I present things, that you hear me make the distinctions where they need to be made, so that you're not listening thinking that I'm painting a picture of what I'm saying, what I'm advocating freedom is, or Levinas. I agree with what Levinas argues here, how the temptation of temptation inhibits freedom. But we have to deal with the contrary directly and try to understand its logic in order to overcome it best. So tracking with Survey Pinker's description of the freedom of indifference helps us to comprehend Levinas' articulation of the temptation of temptation. Likewise, by following Pinker's outline of the freedom for excellence, we will be able to follow Levinas' solution to overcome the temptation of temptation more exactly. And I'll write these two kinds of freedom on the dry erase board in a moment, once I introduce this, what's meant by the freedom for excellence. So, the freedom for excellence is traceable back to the scholastic theology of Thomas Aquinas, wherein freedom is always defined in relation to the good. So Levinas, his work is not exactly that of Thomas Aquinas, but there's a common genus here. So I'm using the work of Thomas Aquinas and Survey Pinker to understand the work of Levinas better, more exactly what's meant by this temptation of temptation. In his book entitled Of God Who Comes to Mind, Levinas writes, quote, "The goodness of the good of the good that neither sleeps nor slumbers, inclines the movement it calls forth to turn it away from the good and orient it toward the other, and only thus toward the good. End quote. So the basis for Levinas' phenomenological ethics is not an abstract notion of the good as such, but a concrete proximity of the other where the good comes to mind, where God comes to mind in this intersubjective relationship between self and other, recognizing the call of the other for me to be responsible for her. So the good is proclaimed in the goodness of the other. The good, capital G good, is good in as much as the other and this ethical relationship is good. The proximity of the call of the other signifies goodness, this fellowship, this friendship, this ethical being for the other is revealed in the concrete, in the flesh, as the essence of goodness. So I think this is very exact philosophy, very exact phenomenology, what Levinas is getting at here. But we have something parallel in the world of scholastic metaphysics with Thomas Aquinas, even thinking about the good as such. But it's when we combine these things, I think, that we get this full picture of contemplative ethics, you could say. So to draw closer in proximity to the good through personal acts expands not only personal freedom, but the freedom of all, and enhances the common good. The freedom for excellence is constantly ordered to the good, and the universal summons to communal beatitude. It proceeds from reason and the will, but free will is not absolute. For both Thomas Aquinas and Levinas, free will is not the essence of freedom. It is not an absolute. Free will is subordinate to the good, is accountable to the good. Free will must submit perpetually to the teleology of the mature virtuous life and the principal end of happiness oriented toward the good. So that's Thomas Aquinas. Without a freedom for excellence, all of one's actions are united. Without a freedom for excellence, all of one's actions are dislocated from one another in that freedom of indifference. But within a freedom for excellence, all of one's actions are united in an ordered whole, and law plays a pedagogical role in shaping the will to choose freely and habitually what is good. So some people have said you can't legislate morality. In some ways, yes, this is true, but in other ways, I would say it's false. Law has a pedagogical function to teach people what is good and what is evil. So, as Augustine says, an unjust law is no law at all, and neither is ambiguous ones. So, to have more precision in lawmaking helps to teach everyone in the polis what is good, what constitutes the good in this particular culture, not in a relativistic way, but in a universal way. So freedom grows in this freedom for excellence to the degree that the good is pursued and evil is avoided. The perfection of freedom mirrors the perfection of the good. In biblical language, one must enter into a covenant relationship with the good to be truly free. However, it is important to note that, whereas for Thomas Aquinas, the good is something distinct from the personal other, for Levinas, the good is identical to the glorious face of the other, signified by her incessant call for me to become responsible for her. So what's meant by the good in the work of Levinas? This ethical proximity of persons, of others. The good emerges here, is signified here. So welcome everyone, yes, to this live stream. Again, feel free to put any comments and questions as in the chat as we go. Thinking about Emmanuel Levinas, taking commentary from my 2021 book, Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with us. Thinking about law, freedom, and the temptation of temptation. But thinking here in this moment of the discourse, along with Thomas Aquinas in relation to Levinas, thinking about the goodness in the work of Levinas then is the active responsibility itself as desperate call and affirmative response. The good, the divine comes to mind within the context of the interpersonal ethical relationship and nowhere else. So again, to quote Levinas in his book of God Who Comes to Mind, quote, he writes, "We have designated this manner for the infinite or for God to refer from the heart of its very desirability to the undesirable proximity of the others by the term eleity. This is an extraordinary turning around of the desirability of the desirable, of the supreme desirability calling to itself the rectilinear rectitude of desire. God is good in this very precise, eminent sense. God does not fill me with goods, but compels me to goodness, which is better than to receive goods." So this is, end quote. Levinas, this is how he speaks about how God comes to mind, how the good is signified, how the infinite is signified, again, within this intersubjective ethical relationship between self and other, I, the one called to responsibility for the other. So let me just summarize then this argument so far about this freedom for excellence in contrast to the freedom of indifference. I remember when I was doing graduate studies in theology and philosophy in my master's degree before my doctorate, reading Survey Pinker's book, The Sources of Christian Ethics, and being very convinced by it, impressed by it, and then influenced by it. So it's really a joy to think about these two diametrically opposed freedoms, a freedom of and a freedom for. I mean, the this difference right here, the of versus the for. Freedom of indifference in contrast to a freedom for excellence. So that's the language of Survey Pinker, which helps us better understand this Talmudic reading of Levinas called the temptation of temptation. So again, how are these two different freedoms? How do they understand freedom? So the freedom of indifference, the essence of this freedom is free will, where the essence of freedom for excellence is the good. To choose what is good means to become more free. Whereas in this freedom of indifference, simply to choose is the essence of freedom. It doesn't matter what's chosen. And even all the better to put in sharp relief this essence of free will when what is chosen is completely unpredictable and varies all the time. It shows this power of arbitration that is not tethered to anything else at all. No idea of the good or God or command or law or even responsibility. It is totally autonomous. And this is the postmodern understanding of freedom in most cultures. The essence of freedom is the power to choose, not to choose wisely necessarily, but to choose whatever. And it's totally autonomous. That is The self, the autos, is a nomos, a law to itself. The self is self-legislating in this freedom of indifference. Whereas here, this freedom, in contrast to autonomy, is heteronomous. The law comes from an elsewhere than the self. The moral agency of the self, moving toward freedom, depends on a light from an elsewhere that needs to illuminate free will. Free will by itself is totally dark, is not understanding. Yes, we have a power to choose. We have free will. But what is being chosen? What is influencing the choice? What are the patterns of choosing? And how is the good involved? Are the choices themselves good or lacking in goodness? This will affect future choices. So we have the evolution of habits of being, habits of moral being based on patterns of choosing. So yes, it is fitting the halo of light is on the side of the freedom for excellence. Thanks for pointing that out. I'll have to be careful not to switch it here. But this is good. This is so helpful to understand. This is so helpful to get into the real essence of freedom, because so often there's a conflation of freedom for free will itself, for choice itself. But that is not the essence of freedom, according to Thomas Aquinas, according to Jewish Torah, according to Catholic social teaching, according to the phenomenology of Levinas. This freedom for excellence is the point. And law here, in this concept of freedom of indifference, law is, we could say, restrictive. It gets in the way of my autonomy. It makes me accountable. It inhibits my freedom. Whereas here, law, when we're talking about just law is meant to be pedagogical. It's not meant to be a hindrance to freedom, but a key to unlocking the fullness of freedom. This is why in Levinas, law is very paradoxical, this relationship between law and freedom, because we would tend to see law as a threat to freedom, like the less laws, the better. But living in a lawful society, at least to some degree with civil laws, we know that law is good. If there were no traffic laws, there would be many more accidents. There would be much more driving chaos. But law has a role to guide the moral agent according to this heteronomy of the good. So the good is meant to be inscribed through the grammar of law, if law is done well. So we see the difference of these kinds of freedom. And again, this freedom for excellence coincides with Levinas' idea of being for the other. It's a freedom with conation. It's a freedom that strives. It's a freedom that moves toward the good. The good is the prize. It's not just choosing whatever, whenever, however, but it is a moral constancy that builds, that grows. To quote the evangelical preacher Charles Swindoll, sow a thought, reap an act. Sow an act, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. So we see the genealogy of freedom that begins with thought. And thank you for bringing up this point, including rationality. Yes, exactly. So Aquinas views free will as rational deliberation. So here, not only is law restrictive in a freedom of indifference, but so is reason. Um, uh, Reason itself is a kind of wet blanket for free will, whereas for Aquinas, in this freedom for excellence, yes, as you say, it involves rational deliberation. And we say something is rational to the degree that it is in reference to the good, the universal good, discerning good from its lack, which we call evil. So yes, rational deliberation is very important here. Whereas here we don't have rational deliberation, we have pure arbitration, just pure choice. And the more pure the choice, the better. So we see the difference here. Thank you for bringing up that really important point about the role of reason in mediating the good to the will. So this is helpful for us to understand better Levinas and his freedom that he calls, again, a non-freedom, a beyond freedom, overcoming the temptation of evil by avoiding the temptation of temptation. So I'll present for about 10 more minutes on today's live stream and wrap it up. So if you have further comments and questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But Levinas' strategy for surmounting the temptation of temptation is quite similar to Survey Pinker's portrayal of this freedom for excellence over and against the freedom of indifference. So in other words, the freedom for excellence is not indifferent to the good. It's very interested in it. And so this indifference word has both positive and negative connotations in the Judeo-Christian tradition. We think of St. Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises and him talking about a spirit of indifference in relation to the will of God. That is a positive meaning. But to think of a freedom of indifference is to have no compass, no real moral compass, no orientation to God, the good, reason, beatitude, happiness, law, nothing. It's purely autonomous, and it wants it that way. But freedom for excellence is quite different and is concerned about the good, is concerned about love, is concerned about responsibility for the other. So Levinas argues that, quote, Westerners opposed to a limited and overly well-defined existence want to taste everything themselves, want to travel the universe. But, he says, there is no universe without the circles of hell, end quote. So Levinas insists on the sober reality that not everything is good, and therefore we should conduct our search for knowledge with careful discretion. So if one proceeds with a freedom of indifference in a purely autonomous, self-legislating way, coupled with this worldview that wants to taste everything, experience everything, and thereby become someone that way, what he's saying is that person will not avoid the circles of hell. They will enter there sooner or later and most likely be stuck in them, trapped in them, in things like addiction, in things like patterns of vice, which repeat themselves, versus patterns of virtue, which will repeat themselves. So Levinas challenges us in this way. Who desires to roam about the circles of hell? Yet it is the temptation of temptation which wants to keep the circles of hell within its ambiguous range of possibilities. Rationally, we would say that's not a good idea. Why would I want to keep the circles of hell within the range of my own most possibilities? Because I'm not trusting the good. I'm suspicious that there's good elsewhere besides the good. But for the integrity of being, the integrity of metaphysical understanding of being and the concept of the good, we can't divide it up. There's a wholeness and completeness and perfection of the good, where if we're aiming at the good, we don't need to worry about being disappointed, that we will be fully satisfied, fully fulfilled. Um, but this temptation of temptation wants to keep the circles of hell within its ambiguous range of possibilities. Levinas says that the temptation of temptation is philosophy itself, in contrast to a wisdom which knows everything without experiencing it. This is so interesting. In the work of Levinas, we hit upon these great paradoxes. That is Levinas a philosopher? We would say yes, Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, philosopher of the 20th century. But he's saying philosophy itself involves this compromise with the temptation of temptation in terms of acquiring more and more knowledge, and that knowledge itself is a form and figure of living this temptation of temptation. I want to know more. Why? Why do I want to know more? So I can experience more knowledge, so I can maybe gain more power. We've heard the saying, knowledge is power, and more power to travel the universe, including the circles of hell. But Levinas points to a wisdom, which still we could say is the philia sophia, philosophy, a wisdom which knows everything without experiencing it. In other words, I don't have to learn the hard way. I don't have to experience everything directly on my own for myself. I can learn from the experiences of other people, good and bad, that this is what I want to choose for myself because I see where it leads. I see the teleology of those kinds of choices. I see the teleology of virtue and the teleology of vice. And I choose virtue because, and here's another paradox, I'm being called by it. And I say yes. So there's an attraction of the good. The good is at once true and beautiful, and it attracts, it draws us, it woos us. And all we have to do is let ourselves be drawn, let ourselves be wooed, let ourselves be caught up in the sway of the good, and we will not be disappointed. Thank you for your question. Is this maybe similar to what St. Aquinas was talking about regarding the vice of curiosity? Yes, exactly. This temptation of temptation. The difference between curiosity and studiousness. There's a real difference. So Augustine makes this distinction. I think Aquinas makes a similar distinction as you're pointing to. You know, we have a saying, curiosity killed the cat. And there's truth in that saying. So we have to be very careful about curiosity, especially those of us who are very philosophically minded, scientifically minded. We want to uncover more and more truth, more and more goodness, more and more beauty, more and more being, metaphysically in a transcendental way. However, curiosity doesn't always get us there. If we're curious about the deprivation of good, and I fill my senses with scenes of the deprivation of goodness, I will not necessarily be growing in virtue or freedom. So curiosity is a curious thing, and we have to be careful with it. It's a kind of, I would say, yeah, kind of double-edged sword. On one hand, in academic pursuits, there's a goodness of curiosity in that we're curious to know the truth more. We have curious questions. It's a good thing, you know, for a child to be curious and wonder about a lot of things, ask a lot of questions, especially why. But at the same time, to be curious too, what did that say? Or let me see that video or that movie or hear this, or be exposed to that. There can be a lot of damage done to the self. So even Jesus in the gospel says the eyes are a light to the body. And, if the eyes are full of light, so will the body be full of light. But if the eyes are darkened, again, we think of the deprivation of the good, even in observing events and scenes that are disturbing to conscience and whatever, then we have the eyes grow dim, and darkness also is, light vacates the body, so the body's dark. So yeah, this question about curiosity is a very good one, but it's better to think of, instead of curiositas, studiositas, in the Latin, to be studious, to be discerning, to be rationally deliberating. I don't have to experience things that I know from a distance are not good for me. I don't have to go get drunk to find out what is it like to be drunk. I've seen other people. I've seen bad things happen. I don't need to go there. And even if I've never experienced being drunk, that's a win. That's a good thing. It's a win. It's a victory for freedom. I am more free because of it. I will keep my distance um, from temptation and sin, and even the temptation of temptation. So I just want to wrap up a couple more points for this live stream then. The philosopher feeds on the ongoing temptation of temptation, typically, arrested in the pretense to omniscience without admitting limit or restriction. The covenantal sage, in contrast, is the one who binds himself or herself to divine wisdom through filial trust. As Levinas writes elsewhere in these Talmudic readings, quote, we think, like our text, that consciousness and seeking, taken as their own preconditions, are like naivete, the temptation of temptation, a tortuous path leading to ruin. The bogdim, this Hebrew concept, are the unfaithful, breaking a fundamental covenant. To them are opposed the yesharim, the upright. So this wisdom, which knows everything without experiencing it, is the wisdom of the yesharim, the upright. Whereas the bogdim want to know everything by experiencing it directly, autonomously, and this is a path leading to ruin. And we just have to think about people we know, news headlines, so on, so on. We can learn so much secondhand, and that's a great place to learn so many lessons about life. And to let the experiences of other people be instructive for our own. Not insisting on, I need to taste it myself. I need to experience it for myself. This goes back to what he's calling like a bad naivete that is essentialized in consciousness itself, in seeking, in a certain kind of phenomenology, even that wants to gather up and gobble up the plasticity of manifestation, as Levinas calls it. So Levinas is proposing something quite different, that a freedom through covenant, a freedom through a covenant relationship that is forged through Torah, through law, teaching, instruction, a covenant relationship with the one true God. Thinking of the primordial human couple who ate from the symbolic tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In contrast to them, the wise one is the person who trusts Hashem's command and recounts the possibility of transgressing this life-giving command. It renounces the possibility of transgressing this life-giving command. The truly wise one knows what is good and evil by trusting in divine testimony rather than demanding to determine this knowledge on his or her own apart from God. Levinas writes that, quote, overcoming the temptation of temptation would then mean going within oneself further than oneself, end quote. Toward whom does one go further than oneself, if not the other? To overcome the temptation of temptation requires going further than complacent and solipsistic self-sufficiency by committing oneself at all times to responsibility for the other. And I just want to end on a couple quotes, one from Pope John Paul II and his encyclical entitled Veritatis Splendor, in Latin, on the splendor of truth, where he speaks about the divine prohibition to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in those opening chapters of the Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Genesis. John Paul II writes, quote, with this imagery, Revelation teaches that the power to decide what is good and what is evil does not belong to man, but to God alone. The man is certainly free inasmuch as he can understand and accept God's commands. And he possesses an extremely far-reaching freedom, since he can eat of every tree of the garden. But man's freedom is not unlimited. It must halt before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for it is called to accept the moral law given by God, what Thomas Aquinas calls the eternal law revealed in and through divine law, but also natural law, both revelation and reason. In fact, human freedom finds its authentic and complete fulfillment precisely in the acceptance of that law of God. God, who alone is good, knows perfectly what is good for man, and by virtue of his very love proposes this good to man in the commandments. End quote. John Paul II, Veritatis Splendor, paragraph 35. And then two final quotes, one from Levinas in the same essay on the temptation of temptation, where he writes, quote, an innocence without naivete, an uprightness without stupidity, an absolute uprightness, which is also absolute self-criticism, read in the eyes of the one who is the goal of my uprightness and whose look calls me into question, the other person who faces me. It is a movement toward the other, which does not come back to its point of origin the way diversion comes back, incapable as it is of transcendence, a movement beyond anxiety and stronger than death, end quote, Levinas. And we think too of Pascal Bruckner's idea of innocence, thinking about this disease of individualism in his work called The Temptation of Innocence, where he writes, quote, I call innocence the disease of individualism, living in this temptation of temptation, we could say in Levinasian terms. It consists in trying to escape the consequences of our own acts, attempting to enjoy the advantages of liberty without suffering any of the disadvantages, end quote. Powerful quote there to end on for this live stream. So I thank you all for joining me. If you have any further questions, you can put them in the chat now before I sign off for this live stream, taking much commentary from my 2021 book entitled Emmanuel Levinas and Variations on God with Us. Incredible thinking, I think, by Emmanuel Levinas. This is coming from chapter 4 of the book entitled Law and Freedom. And I just really enjoy talking about these philosophical insights and truths to understanding the authentic essence of freedom. Again, this contrast of the freedom of indifference and the freedom for excellence. So with Levinas, we're moving toward what Survey Pinkers, the commentator on Thomas Aquinas, is calling this freedom for excellence that involves a being for the other, living in responsibility for the other. Whereas This freedom of indifference is very egocentric, all about the conatus ascendi, if that at all. It's very autonomous, it's self-legislating and completely arbitrary. But this heteronymous freedom depends on the revelation of the alterity of the good in relation to the self through divine command, beginning with Jewish Torah, extending all the way through, I would propose, through Catholicism, Christianity, and the law summed up in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So two quite different concepts of freedom, and how a person or community even understands freedom will make all the difference for how we live and our being in the world. Thank you for this question. Can I touch on how to balance the study of philosophy, theology, and the practice of mental prayer? Yeah, I like the word you use, balance. It's definitely a balance. Um, you know, today I want to pray more. So to do a live stream like this and to do philosophy like this, I would say in my own experience depends on prayer. The life of prayer comes first. Without prayer, there's no theology. Theology itself is the surplus of prayer. It's the word of God testified to by the theologian, by the word of God is testified to by the witness, who is the theologian, and the philosopher. And it's been said every theology risks a philosophy. But we have a philosopher like Edith Stein, who talked about that the study of philosophy and theology, translating it, writing it, reading it itself can be part of one's prayer life, when especially we're studying really good, sound philosophy and theology. So there can be some overlap with the study of philosophy and theology and the life of prayer. And the life of prayer, as within Catholicism, we read in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, has three primary forms: vocal prayer, meditation, what we might call mental prayer, as you put it, and then contemplation, thinking of Teresa of Avila, the prayer of recollection, the prayer of quiet, the prayer of union, these, the heights of contemplative prayer. So yeah, it's relating all these things together. I think the engine of prayer gets warmed up always through vocal prayer, something like Lectio Divina, something like the Rosary, something like Liturgy of the Hours. The prayers from the Manual of Indulgences are really wonderful. Prayers of deliverance are always in order, of different kinds. There's this little book, Prayers Against the Powers of Darkness. It's not always available like on Amazon, but you can try to find it online. Sometimes you can find it. But these prayers are very powerful to keep oneself delivered from demonic influence. And the application of holy water every day, these are big things, and they help us do better philosophy with a purified reason. Reason itself can become very irrational, especially when there's sin in the part of the thinker. And so we have to be delivered from sin, delivered from temptation, delivered from the temptation of temptation. And this would be the Christian case, that we can't just will this freedom for excellence. We have to be empowered to live it by God's grace coming through the sacraments of the church. So these are very important points from a Catholic perspective. Thanks so much for that question. And this other question, how do we reconcile free will with predestination? Does Judaism have a similar concept? Did Levinas wrestle with these concepts? The term predestination itself is fraught with so many meanings. There's like a Calvinist concept of predestination, an Augustinian concept of predestination, that are not exactly the same thing. And then like a Catholic concept would be more of the Augustinian understanding of predestination, to think of the Pauline language that God has predestined us to be his adopted children, and these kind of things that are said in scripture and the tradition of the church. So in terms of predestination, it's fraught with paradox too. In the work of Levinas, thinking about this in the Jewish experience of being a chosen people, yes, a people predestined by God to enter into this covenant relationship, but also as a light to the nations. We see this in the writings of the prophets, that begins with the Jewish people, but the Jewish people themselves as a chosen people are witness to the nations. And so there's a predestination within the self-understanding of Judaism, predestined by God to be this chosen people. And for Levinas, above all, this predestination of being chosen is enacted through the ethical call of the other person who faces me. So it has universal anthropological bearing on a global scale. So it's a Jewish intuition, but it's not meant to be kept a secret in Judaism. So Levinas, as a philosopher in France, from Lithuania but immigrated to France, he's showcasing the truth about this ethical monotheism that is on display to highest degree in Judaism, sharing this out in his academic philosophy. And what I'm commenting on today in the Talmudic lectures is a different kind of writing of his, but it's still very philosophical, but it's not an academic paper per se, or a strictly philosophical writing. So yeah, Levinas, there's a predestination for every self, but he doesn't want to talk about it in a kind of collective way. He wants to talk very specifically. There's a predestination of the ego, a predestination of the I. The vocation has been assigned. The mission has been appointed to be responsible for the other. That's predestination. That's the destiny of the self is already determined, and it's a vocation, a life lived for the other, responsibility for the other. So in terms of eschatology, all of this, divine judgment is sealed in the earthly ethical relationship. So that's eternity is contained therein for Levinas. So there's not this speculation as to what happens when I die. For Levinas, it's such a radical concept of this predestination of the ego to live in responsibility for the other, that he says that the self forgets about his own death. The self is not mindful of some reward on the side of the other in some kind of eschatological rendezvous. But the prize of responsibility is just that, living it. That's the point of being human that we find through his phenomenological analysis of the face of the other, the call of the other, and the ethical gestalt or structure of being a self. And free will is much secondary to his understanding of freedom. What's most decisive is the call, not even the response. Yeah, there is a response involved. It involves the free will of the self for Levinas, but that response is not what generates freedom, but the call itself leads the self into freedom through responsibility for the other. And so somebody could have this common understanding of freedom, so much responsibility, so little freedom. But for Levinas, it's the opposite. So much responsibility, so much freedom. Thank you all so much for joining me in this live stream today. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Your presence always is a great encouragement to me. Maybe I'll continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.